Not always the one who is most heard is the one who speaks the most. Have you noticed that? In meetings, family discussions, or even in everyday conversations. The person who fills the space with too many words tends to lose the audience's attention. Meanwhile, the one who listens and waits for the right moment to speak often creates a silence more powerful than any shout. It's no coincidence that both Schopenhauer and Plato reflected on this idea, with Plato stating, "Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something." Now, think about the lion on the savannah. It doesn't roar without reason. It observes in silence, paying close attention to every movement, and only strikes when victory is certain. This kind of self-control is becoming increasingly rare among people. Nowadays, talking has become a compulsion. The fear of falling behind or going unnoticed drives many to say anything, in any way possible. But what if silence is exactly what you need to be taken seriously? Today, you'll understand that silence is more than just a pause between words. It's a tool for strategy, control, and intelligence. We'll see how this applies at work, in relationships, and even in the most delicate negotiations. This is not about remaining quiet out of submission, but about using silence as a deliberate move of control. By the end, I'll show you a practical way to apply this in your daily life. No silly challenges or radical life changes, just a simple, straightforward adjustment that will change the way people see you, and more importantly, the way you see yourself. If this makes sense to you, keep reading. Isn't it interesting how silence, which at first glance seems like absence, can actually be one of the most powerful forms of presence? We live in a culture where imposing yourself is often associated with speaking more, taking up sonic space, and showing what you've got. But if we observe closely, true power lies with those who master the art of not speaking. It's a paradox that's hard to accept because it challenges the notion that those who remain silent are irrelevant. In reality, the opposite is often true. Pay attention to daily life. In a work meeting, there's always someone who feels compelled to talk constantly. Even if they have nothing relevant to add, silence makes them uncomfortable. So they fill the void with loose words, redundant explanations, or obvious remarks. On the other side, there's the leader. And I'm not talking about a job title, but a mindset. The leader listens, observes, waits for the perfect moment to enter the conversation. And when they do, every word lands like a well-calculated chess move, a move that shifts the entire game. Think about it. The impatient chess player moves their pieces without strategy, reacting impulsively to what they see. Each move is a reflex, not a decision. Meanwhile, the meticulous player examines the entire board before making a move. They pause for a long time, letting their opponent grow anxious, and then make a single move that changes everything. Just like in chess, silence can be this strategic pause, the space for observation that reveals the gaps in the game no one else sees. This same pattern repeats itself in personal relationships. You know that family argument where one person insists on having the last word. They get agitated, raise their voice, and start repeating their arguments in an attempt to win by sheer volume. Now, compare that with someone who listens to the end and, with a single phrase, dismantles the entire conflict. Someone with emotional control doesn't need to compete for the last word, because silence has already prepared them for it. But what's behind this behavior? Why do so many people feel the need to talk all the time? The answer is simple: insecurity. When someone feels threatened, they try to fill the space with words, as if trying to prove themselves to others. On the other hand, those who are secure in themselves have no urgency to prove anything. True control comes from knowing there's no need to fill every empty space. This logic is nothing new. Schopenhauer once said that external noise is a sign of internal disorder. And, in a way, the same applies to words. Those who can't tolerate silence reveal a kind of internal disarray, whether it's anxiety or the fear of seeming irrelevant. Meanwhile, those who feel comfortable in silence send the opposite message: calm, composure, and confidence. So, the next time you're in a conversation, pay attention. Who's in control? Is it the person who speaks nonstop, or the one who silently observes, carefully studying every move before acting? Now, ask yourself, which one do you want to be? Silence is not just the absence of words, it is presence, strategy, and control, while noise distracts. Silence organizes. It creates a space for perception that few people know how to use consciously. That's why so many works on strategy and philosophy emphasize the value of silence. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, taught, "All warfare is based on deception. When we are ready to attack, we must appear incapable." In other words, silence is not passivity. It's the invisible preparation for the next move. To understand this in practice, think about a job interview. The recruiter asks a challenging question. How would you resolve a conflict with your manager? There are two types of candidates. The first responds immediately, anxious to appear efficient, but the rush causes them to stumble over weak arguments. The second listens, pauses for a few seconds, and then responds clearly and objectively. Now, imagine you're the recruiter. Which candidate would you hire? The second one, of course. Why? Because that pause conveyed reflection and confidence. The silence wasn't the absence of an answer. It was the time needed for the answer to be strong and decisive. This logic also applies to negotiations. If you've ever been part of a buying or selling negotiation, you may have noticed that in tense moments, the first person to speak often loses. It's almost an unwritten rule. After an offer is made, the first to break the silence usually ends up at a disadvantage. A classic example of this is the salesperson who, noticing the customer is silent, feels the urge to keep talking to avoid losing control of the situation. In their rush, they offer extra discounts or special terms, even when the customer didn't ask for them. All of this happens because the customer's silence made them uncomfortable. If we look beyond the professional sphere, we'll see the same thing happening in interpersonal discussions. How many times, during an argument, does one person become so uneasy with the other's silence that they end up saying more than they should? This strategic silence creates doubt, discomfort, and ultimately, exposure. At that moment, the person who remains silent gains control of the situation. Silence also carries symbolic power. Many times, the absence of words says more than 1,000 explanations. Have you ever been in a meeting where everyone was talking, but suddenly, someone who hadn't spoken the entire time makes a single comment and shifts the direction of the discussion? It's as if all the other voices were just background noise, and the person who waited to speak brought the focus back. In this case, silence was the tool that gave weight to the words. But what makes silence so powerful, simple? It breaks the logic of continuous flow. People are used to a constant stream of words, notifications, and stimuli. Silence is an interruption in that flow. It creates a vacuum, a space where people are forced to reflect. When you remain silent, the other person feels compelled to fill the empty space. But that emptiness doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them. This dynamic plays out in meetings, interviews, discussions, and even in sales negotiations. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation where you feel the urge to respond immediately, do the opposite. Wait. Don't rush. Don't give in to the discomfort. Because often, true power doesn't lie in speaking more, but in knowing the right moment to speak. Sometimes, being underestimated is the best position you can be in. It may seem contradictory, but it's an ancient and effective strategy. Sun Tzu said that in war, if you are strong, appear weak. If you are near, appear far. This is not cowardice or submission. It's strategic intelligence. Those who are not seen as a threat are not closely watched, and those who aren't watched have the freedom to move unnoticed. In philosophy, we find an iconic example of this practice. Socrates, he was a master of the art of playing ignorant during debates. He would ask simple questions and pretend not to know the answers, when in reality, he was guiding the other person toward error. This technique became known as Socratic irony. He made his opponent believe they were in control of the discussion, only to dismantle their entire line of reasoning with a single well-placed question. Socrates didn't need to appear the smartest. He just needed to be the smartest. In the modern world, we see clear examples of this. Imagine a boss who, instead of constantly asserting their authority, allows an intern to propose solutions. The intern feels they had a brilliant idea, but the boss had already considered that path all along. By not asserting their dominance, the boss lets the intern shine, but in reality, the one in control was the boss the entire time. This isn't manipulation. It's a way to delegate without losing control. People like this have one thing in common. They don't feel the need to prove they're in charge because they already know they are. This pattern is also visible in classrooms. The student who stays silent for most of the class is often seen as distracted or disinterested. Then, at some point, they raise their hand and ask a question that everyone else had in mind, but didn't have the courage to ask. At that moment, the teacher shifts their attention to that student, and the rest of the class falls silent. Why does this happen? Because the one who stays silent creates the expectation that, when they finally speak, they will have something important to say. And more often than not, they do. Another very common example is in negotiations. People who talk too much and try to appear smart often reveal too much about their interests. On the other hand, the one who appears to not understand or be in no hurry takes a position of advantage. It's like the customer who, upon hearing a salesperson go on and on, remains silent, simply observing. They don't seem convinced, nor do they reject the offer. Meanwhile, the salesperson becomes desperate to close the deal, and the customer already knows they'll get a better discount. This is why the best negotiators master the art of silence. Appearing less interested is often the key to getting more. But why does this work? The logic is simple. People tend to lower their guard around those who don't seem like a threat. Think of a card game. If everyone thinks you have a weak hand, they won't watch your moves closely. This allows you to surprise them when it's time to act. The opposite is also true. If everyone thinks you have the strongest hand at the table, all eyes will be on you, and every misstep will be noticed. This is exactly what Sun Tzu teaches us. The strong who appear weak have freedom. The weak who try to appear strong expose themselves. So the next time you feel the urge to prove yourself or show how smart you are, ask yourself, what do I gain by exposing myself right now? Sometimes, appearing a little uninformed or uninterested can be the smartest move. Not because you are less capable, but because you're calculating each step. Just as Socrates did, as Sun Tzu taught, and as truly strategic leaders still do today. Silence is not just a communication strategy. It's also a tool for emotional self-control, while external noise is visible and audible. Internal noise is often harder to perceive, and many times, it's that inner noise that makes us lose control during discussions, arguments, and conflicts. Knowing how to remain silent in the face of provocation is not weakness. It's the pinnacle of emotional control. Imagine a couple's argument. One of them raises their voice, arguing non-stop, and in some cases, even starts shouting. The other, however, stays silent. But it's not a silence of contempt. It's a silence of attention. They don't react right away. They don't hit back. They just observe. What happens next? The one who's shouting starts to feel exposed. Hearing the echo of their own noise, the other person's silence becomes a mirror, making the lack of control even more visible. At that point, the person yelling loses control of the situation and often realizes it too late. This dynamic doesn't only happen in personal relationships, in work meetings. The pattern repeats itself. When someone loses their patience and speaks aggressively, the expectation is that the other person will respond in kind. If the response is an immediate reaction, the conflict escalates. But when the response is silence, the cycle is broken. That unexpected pause destabilizes the other person's impulsive reaction. Many times, the person who loses their patience also loses their reason. This principle of self-control through silence was widely used by Gandhi during protests against British rule. He refused to resort to violence, even in the face of extreme provocation, when his followers wanted to fight back. He insisted, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." In this context, Gandhi's silence wasn't omission. It was absolute control over the impulse to retaliate. His peaceful resistance exposed the brutality of his oppressors without him having to say a single word. But you don't need to be Gandhi to understand this. In daily life, this logic manifests in small interactions. In an argument with a coworker, the person who reacts in the heat of the moment often says things they later regret. On the other hand, the person who allows themselves a few seconds of pause is able to formulate a clearer, more assertive, and more definitive response. This pause of silence is one of the most used techniques in professional negotiations. It's not passivity, it's preparation. It's no coincidence that people say, "Whoever shouts loses their reason." This doesn't mean that the quietest person is always right, but that those who can't hold back their impulse to explode reveal that they've lost control of themselves. And losing control of oneself is handing control over to someone else. When you explode in anger, the one controlling you is no longer you. Silence, on the other hand, is not an emptiness. It's proof that the mind is still in charge. It's like the pause of a deep breath before giving a response. Often, this 10-second interval can be enough to avoid saying a word that, once spoken, can never be taken back. Everyone has been through this. You say something without thinking, and minutes later, you realize it would have been better to stay quiet. If you had waited just 10 seconds, that phrase would never have left your mouth. Want to put this into practice? The next time you feel the urge to respond immediately, try one simple thing. Take a deep breath and count to 10. Yes, it sounds simple, but it's incredibly effective. This pause is not just a way to control what you're about to say, but a way to show yourself that you're still in control. It's not submission, nor is it omission. It's self-mastery. And what if the other person keeps talking, shouting, or insisting? Remember, the greatest shout of control isn't a shout at all. It's the silence that stands firm. This kind of silence isn't weakness. It's the ultimate act of strength. The person who maintains emotional control in the middle of chaos doesn't need words to prove it. Pride can be a burden disguised as strength. It often makes us believe that we need to win arguments, prove our intelligence, and have the last word in order to be respected. But what do we really gain from this? If we look closely, we'll see that pride, when poorly managed, pushes us into pointless fights and makes us lose important relationships. What could have been resolved with a moment of silence turns into a cycle of power struggles. Schopenhauer, known for his critical view of human vanity, experienced this firsthand. His own mother accused him of having an intellectual pride that prevented him from accepting other people's perspectives. Schopenhauer viewed the world with such rigor and rationality that he struggled to tolerate what he saw as mediocrity in other people's opinions. His inability to accept others was often seen as arrogance. This type of pride isn't hard to spot today. Just think of that person at work who refuses to be corrected, or turns every disagreement into a duel of egos. This becomes especially clear in professional environments. Imagine an employee correcting their boss in front of the entire team. Even if the employee is technically right, the way they position themselves can create unnecessary tension. Often, the boss doesn't respond with logic. They respond with power. This isn't just a matter of the boss's ego, but a matter of authority dynamics. Now, compare this to the person who, instead of correcting the boss publicly, waits for the meeting to end and makes the comment in private. The correction happens all the same, but the way it's received is completely different. This scenario isn't just about work. It's about pride and control. Strategic silence here isn't submission. It's intelligence. It's giving up a momentary victory to achieve a greater one later. This same logic applies to personal relationships. How many times, in an argument between friends or partners, does the last to speak walk away feeling like they won the conversation? But did they really win? Or were they just the last one who didn't know when to stop talking? The logic here is simple. Speaking out of pride has a cost, and the price is often higher than it seems. In the heat of the moment, we feel the urge to defend our position. But the next day, when the dust settles, that sense of victory often turns into regret. Many friendships and relationships are strained because someone insisted on having the last word. Not because they were right, but because they didn't want to lose the argument. Lao Tzu, the Taoist sage, once warned, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." This idea doesn't mean that silence should be absolute, but rather that those who are sure of themselves don't need to prove it constantly. When you have clarity about who you are, you don't feel the need to fight for speaking time to affirm your intelligence, authority, or relevance. Now, take a moment to reflect. How many arguments have you lost simply because you wanted to have the last word? How many debates turned into unnecessary confrontations because no one was willing to give in? Pride works like this. It convinces you that you're winning, but in reality, you're only increasing emotional strain. And here's the key point. Silence is often the true antidote to pride, not because it defeats you, but because it interrupts the cycle of vanity that leads to endless conflict. The next time you feel the impulse to speak louder or have the last word, ask yourself, what am I really trying to win here? If the answer is, to prove that I'm right, maybe it's time to stop. Not every victory is worth the fight, and silence in this case is not defeat. It's wisdom. Knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is a skill that can completely change how people perceive you. It's not about staying silent out of submission, nor about talking all the time to seem relevant. True power lies in the balance between the two. It's understanding that often, silence isn't the end of a conversation. It's the space where ideas mature. In family situations, for example, arguments often turn into a competition of voices. Everyone wants to win the conversation, have the last word, or prove they're right. Who hasn't experienced this? But take a closer look. How often do you see someone win a family argument by shouting and repeating the same points? What usually happens is the opposite. The more someone insists on having the last word, the more they lose control of the situation. Now, think of the person who, instead of trying to win, listens carefully, and when they do speak, drops a short, direct, and precise statement. The impact is completely different. Nobody argues with someone who delivers a simple, undeniable truth at the right moment. Another clear example is in friendships. Imagine a group of friends discussing a controversial topic. There's always that one person who feels the need to impose their opinion. This person doesn't listen to anyone, interrupts others, and refuses to accept counterpoints. In the end, the friends don't remember what they said, but how much they insisted on winning the conversation. Now, think about the friend who spends most of their time listening. But when they finally speak, they offer a perspective no one had thought of. This person doesn't need to impose anything, because their silence has already built anticipation. The key point here is timing. It's not about speaking less or more, but about knowing when to speak in certain situations. The rush to speak reveals insecurity. Have you ever seen someone who, when contradicted, responds immediately without even thinking? This happens because their discomfort with silence is stronger than their need to reflect. They just want to fill the void. But someone who is secure in their thoughts isn't in a hurry to justify themselves. They wait. They think. And when they speak, it's with conviction. A good way to know when to speak and when to stay silent is to ask yourself, does this need to be said right now? Or can it wait? Often, what seems urgent in the heat of the moment fades after a few seconds of reflection. How many times have you said something and, shortly after, thought, I didn't need to say that? Now think about the opposite. How often have you regretted staying quiet? Usually, what wasn't said can still be said later, but what was spoken impulsively cannot be undone. Here's a simple practice for daily life, with friends and family, during a group conversation. Try to observe more and speak less. When you do speak, contribute something that hasn't been said yet. Not only does this make your words more impactful, but it also shows that you listen before you give your opinion. In arguments and conflicts, when you feel the urge to respond impulsively, pause. Count to 10 before speaking. That's it. This brief pause is enough to shift your brain from reactive mode to rational mode. In text messages, before replying to a message that upset you, close the app for 5 minutes. Many arguments via text happen because of the rush to reply. Digital silence is also a form of control. Silence, in this context, is not just a strategy or a technique. It's a choice to avoid fueling tension. You don't have to do it all the time, or use it in every conversation. But when you do, the impact is undeniable. After all, silence is not just an absence of words. It's a fertile space where ideas are given time to grow. Words have their value, but so does silence. It's not about deciding which is better or more effective, but about recognizing that silence, like words, can open new paths. Sometimes the impulse will be to speak. Other times, it will be to wait. There's no exact formula for this, and perhaps that's the whole point. You don't have to be in control all the time. Sometimes the pause isn't passive waiting. It's a way to let time do its work. Silence has never been about staying quiet forever. It's not the absence of voice, but the presence of intention. Those who choose the right moment to speak are not being passive. They're controlling the rhythm of the conversation. That's power. And throughout this reflection, we've seen how this power shows up in different areas of life. At work, in friendships, and in relationships. Silence proves to be more effective than any rushed speech. It's not about talking less, but about talking better. A precise comment at the end of a conversation can have more impact than dozens of interruptions during it. This isn't a mystery. It's clarity. The real point here is simple. There's no competition between words and silence. One needs the other. Silence gives words their power, just as pauses give music its rhythm. When you master this alternation, your words stop being noise and become a true voice. More than a way to deal with the world, silence is a way to deal with yourself. When you stop reacting to everything, you begin to notice what's happening inside you. Amid the internal noise, a clarity emerges that wasn't there before. It's not about silencing the world. It's about listening to what the world is trying to tell you. For that reason, silence doesn't need to be a rule or a technique. It's an option. And the power of that option lies in the fact that it's yours. If this reflection made you think, maybe it's worth observing. Over the next few days, the moments when you choose to speak or stay silent, pay attention to the effect it has on others and on yourself.